Welcome to Calcast, your Create International podcast. God Network News, where we give you a new perspective
on events happening in our world today.
This is GNN.
This is God Network News, episode 220. Welcome, GNN fans, to another episode of God Network News, the podcast that tells you what God's doing around the world. Not what CNN tells you, but what GNN tells you is going on in the world. If you're tired of listening to all of that crisis network news and you want to hear what God's doing, well, give us a listen. Steve Addison is a great podcaster and very passionate about movements of peoples to Christ. And Steve has his own podcast, very successful podcast, with over 226 podcast episodes. And the name of his podcast is On the Road to No Place Left. And we highly recommend that you subscribe to his podcast because he has an overwhelming library of exciting topics related to movements. And if you want to learn more about movements, this is the place to find the information, and he has lots of training and tools and other resources that will really make your investigation of this topic successful. So we really want to thank Steve Addison and his partners there at movements.net/podcast. That's how you can find it, at movements.net/podcast, for all of the resources that he has given us for these next few podcasts. Thank you very much, Steve.
I was the mission organization that I was involved with. I looked at the history, and they started their mission work in 1910. Mm-hmm. Now, when the first missionaries came, and it has, of course, it's been very hard work for them to come from foreign country, to learn the language, and to understand the culture. And illiteracy was very, very high in those days, so you just can't just simply hand over a Bible or a little piece of literature and trust them to read and understand. So everything has to be stories, and so they were, of course, there were a lot of stories of frustration. And by 1985, I discovered that they had did some research and found out that they had all this, during this time, they had been able to see only 2,000 people come to know the Lord. Mm-hmm. And that was shocking for me because, we lived among 90 million Bhojpuri people here. Mm. And there was no way to do a mission where you have, in 70, 80 years, you have 2,000 people get saved. That's a very disappointing and depressing. And no wonder why this area was also known as the graveyard of mission. And this was not just the story of one mission that I worked with. There were several others who had worked in this area. And so I kind of did the research because I knew a lot of pastors and a lot of people who worked in this area. And they all would advise me. They said, and all the other colleagues, they said, you are a lucky man because you are in one of the biggest church. We had, on record, we had about 500 members in our church. And there were 120 in attendance. So they were all jealous because the others had about 30, 40, 50 people in their church. So So, but I was totally very dissatisfied inside. And I thought, I'm wasting my life. And I just, I couldn't accept my own situation. And I thought, I cannot accept any excuse people are giving me, because there got to be some way to see a breakthrough. They got to see some kind of to break that mindset, because everybody tell the same story, and you are surrounded by that kind of mentality and voices that you start to say the same thing together with others. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. And my dissatisfaction, of course, led me to take a 2-year leave and just do something else instead of pastoring a church and being involved in mission work, so-called mission work, which was just the routine things, doing the same thing. And because my wife comes from Sweden, and we had 3 small children, and we thought, well, this may be a good opportunity to kind of like get to know what Sweden is like. And we went to Sweden, and the same year the recession came in Sweden, so people became unemployed. But luckily, I had a job. I got a job, and 3 small kids, and trying to figure out what next. Just totally depressed, and there was no sign of to lit up. There was no positive. No one had anything positive to say. And when I came to Sweden, of course, that was also they became a time of depressing, because a lot of people had lost their jobs, and by early 90, of course, Sweden was one of the world's most affluent countries, and now having to see decline in economy, and of course that affected the social life and the spiritual life and the church life and the giving in the churches, and a lot of things were happening at the same time. But this passion in me about people being lost in India, not responding to the gospel, and we singing the same song, saying this is the graveyard of mission and nothing happens here. And people even went to the extent of saying nothing will happen here, because if it hasn't happened for 100 years, why should it happen now? But I was convinced of 2 things. One is that our God is real. He doesn't change. No matter what we do, he remains the same. His mission remains the same, and his strategy remains the same. And the people who labor, have labored before, God does not overlook their labor of love. So whatever they have done, even they may have sown with tears, but someone else will reap with joy if we continue to trust the Lord.
You're listening to God Network News Podcast with your host, Cal Curtis. Look up our website at godnetworknews.com.
And the Bible talks about He is the Lord of the harvest, and Isaiah 54 talks about enlarging your tent, and gives you a harvest strategy. That if you are really thinking of harvest, how should your strategy be? That you don't plan of harvest, don't think about harvest with your strength and with your resources, but you plan it in from God's perspective. So, and that's why Isaiah 54 talks about it, saying enlarging your tent.
So what did that look like for you? This is churning away inside you. And how did the Lord break that stalemate for you?
I think there's something happening in my life which I couldn't pinpoint it, because it was very difficult. It's like a blind man trying to kind of find the door, totally being in dark and trying to find an answer. Yet somewhere there was a rays of hope in my heart that, okay, there is an answer, but I don't know what. And I had this hope that tomorrow will be a new day. Tomorrow something will happen. And I mean, I pastored a church for almost 15 years. And during that time, we never ever saw 10 people from a non-Christian background baptized. Not even 10. I'm Christian background, people were baptized, and I baptized a lot of people. And we had the great joy of baptizing young people, leading them to Christ and all that. But then, they were fourth, fifth, sixth generation Christians, but nothing from the outside, nothing from the Hindus or Muslims background.
So what took you back to India then?
I think this passion, I felt like God will do something great. And I shouldn't miss this opportunity because something will happen at that time. And
so faith was growing in you even before you had answers or ever.
Right, exactly. I was totally... there was something planted in my heart, and something was happening, but I had no answer. I had no clue. There was no way of telling, explaining in 4 points or 3 points and saying, okay, this is exactly what's happening. But there was a hope against all hopelessness. Situation was pretty hopeless. I would say hopeless because we did all kinds of evangelism. We did street evangelism. We did drama. We did storytelling. We did everything. We showed films, Jesus films, in villages, and thousands of people who watched the movies. But result was almost zero. People would come forward for prayer, but then they would disappear also. And I think what I discovered in that journey was that we were we're doing the whole mission in a wrong way. And the simplicity in the gospel and presenting the gospel lied in the, was in the making disciple. And once you make disciple and then you do evangelism, we were doing evangelism first. And then we were thinking that someday when people will come to the church, we'll do discipleship, And I think that was the wrong approach, because you disciple first, and then you share the gospel with people, and that's how Jesus did the ministry, and that's what he commanded his disciples to in Matthew 28, to go and make disciple of all nations first. Even the Jesus' very own disciples, they were not a believer when Jesus began to disciple them. And then gradually over the time of relationship, period stretched out over 3.5 years, he showed them who God was, and they came into personal relationship and understanding. And out of that, Jesus asked the question, he said, who do you say that I am? And I think somewhere it has to start with a relationship where people have to see and discover, how does that work for you, in your own life, what you're talking about. You talk about God. God is love. God is, holy. God does not change. God answers prayer. But how does that work in your life? And I think that's where the discipleship comes in.
And what did that look like back in India when you began to take that approach?
That time, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, we were so influenced by church growth movement, and the whole focus was on the church growth, and not on discipleship. And so that was sort of kind of like hoping that someday your pews will be filled, your congregation will explode, and there will be a massive movement somehow within the church, but it was all within the church. And it was not a real picture. People were not just going to walk in to your church and fill the pews just like that.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider donating to help us continue to bring exciting stories fresh from the field. Visit our website at godnetworknews.com and select the PayPal link on the right side of the page, or consider becoming a Patreon partner to receive access to more valuable materials exclusive to our members.